On the morning of December 7th, 1941, America was not asleep. Warnings had already been seen. Messages had already been intercepted. Enemy aircraft had already appeared on radar. But the information stopped moving. The decisions never came. And the warnings died on desks. Minutes later, Pearl Harbor burned. Over 2,400 lives were lost, not because the attack was invisible, but because the truth was left unanswered. This is the story of one of the greatest intelligence failures in American history. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States awoke to catastrophe at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, aircraft lay shattered, and thousands of lives were lost in a matter of hours. For generations, this moment has been remembered as a sudden bolt from the blue. Yet the truth is more disturbing. The attack was not born from ignorance, but from information that existed, circulated, and failed to cohere into action. In the years leading up to war, American intelligence was not asleep. It was overwhelmed. Signals were intercepted, codes partially broken, and warnings issued across a sprawling bureaucracy that had never been tested by modern global conflict. Japan's ambitions were no secret. Its expansion across Asia had been watched with growing alarm. Washington understood that confrontation was likely. What it did not understand was when, where, or how decisively it would arrive. At the center of the failure was fragmentation. Intelligence was divided among the Army, the Navy, and diplomatic channels, each guarding its own information. Coordination was minimal. Rivalry was constant. Reports moved slowly, filtered through layers of command that prized caution over clarity. No single office possessed a full picture, and no mechanism existed to force those pieces together. Warnings did surface. Analysts noted Japanese carrier movements disappearing from known ports. Intercepts suggested heightened operational security. Diplomats reported escalating tension and a hardening tone in Tokyo. Yet each signal, viewed in isolation, appeared ambiguous. The Pacific was vast. Exercises were common. Signals could be misread. Uncertainty became a justification for inaction. Assumptions filled the gaps. American planners believed Japan would strike south toward British or Dutch possessions, where oil and resources beckoned. Pearl Harbor, distant and heavily defended, seemed an unlikely target. Even when danger was acknowledged, it was framed narrowly. Sabotage, not a full-scale aerial assault. Battleships were lined up neatly. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, guarded against spies rather than bombs. Technology offered its own warning. Radar stations on Oahu were operational, but poorly integrated into command structures. On the morning of the attack, operators detected a large inbound formation. The sighting was dismissed as an expected American aircraft. Training, doctrine, and habit overruled the unfamiliar. The system worked. The interpretation failed. Responsibility diffused upward and outward. Commanders assumed Washington would warn them. Washington assumed commanders were alert. Each level believed another held decisive knowledge. In reality, no one did. Intelligence did not fail because it was absent, but because it was unmanaged. Pearl Harbor endures as a lesson precisely because it resists simple blame. There was no single ignored message, no lone villain. Instead, there was a culture unprepared to imagine surprise on that scale. Information existed without urgency, warning without authority, and evidence without synthesis. The bombs that fell that morning ended the debate instantly. What remained was shock, anger, and the realization that modern war would punish not only weakness of arms, but weakness of understanding. Pearl Harbor was not just a military disaster. It was an intelligence failure born of assumption, division, and the dangerous comfort of believing tomorrow would resemble yesterday. It was a warning written in advance, misread in real time, and understood only afterward. The tragedy lies not only in loss, but in preventability obscured by complexity. Pearl Harbor revealed that intelligence without integration is noise, and foresight without imagination is blindness. The lesson would shape American strategy for generations, paid for in lives before it was learned. That failure would echo forward, shaping reforms, fears, and expectations, ensuring Pearl Harbor was never treated as history alone, but as a permanent caution carved into American memory and strategic consciousness globally. Long before bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States was already listening to Japan. In quiet rooms far from Hawaii, cryptanalysts labored over intercepted messages, slowly prying open the language of a potential enemy. By late 1941, American codebreakers had achieved a critical breakthrough. They could read large portions of Japan's diplomatic communications. This intelligence effort, codenamed Magic, was among the most sensitive secrets in Washington. Magic revealed Japan's strategic desperation. The messages spoke of oil shortages, diplomatic dead ends, and an increasingly rigid posture toward the United States. Tokyo was preparing for something drastic. Negotiations were failing. Time was running out. These intercepts were circulated at the highest levels of government, including the White House, the War Department, and Naval Intelligence. The warning signs were real, but they were incomplete. The problem was not access, but interpretation. Diplomatic codes were not military ones. Magic could expose intentions, but rarely tactics. It could show anger, resolve, and deadlines, but not targets. Analysts knew Japan was moving toward war, but they could not say where the first blow would fall. That uncertainty proved fatal. On November 26, 1941, Japanese diplomats in Washington received a final, lengthy message from Tokyo. It instructed them to deliver a 14-part memorandum to the U.S. government at a precise time. The tone was unmistakable. Relations were ending. War was imminent. American codebreakers decrypted the message before it was delivered. President Roosevelt read it the night before the attack. Yet even this did not trigger immediate defensive action at Pearl Harbor. The assumption remained that Japan would strike somewhere else first. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Those targets aligned with Japan's need for resources. Hawaii did not. Logic, grounded in economic reasoning and past behavior, shaped expectations more than imagination. Warnings were sent, but they were vague. Commands in the Pacific were told to be alert, but not alarmed. No specific threat to Pearl Harbor was identified. The messages were cautious, restrained, and filtered through layers of hierarchy. They reflected the same institutional hesitation that had plagued intelligence coordination for years. Meanwhile, Japanese operational security tightened. Radio silence from carrier groups was noted, but not fully understood. Analysts assumed the carriers were still in home waters, concealed by communication discipline. In reality, they were already moving east across the Pacific, beyond the horizon of American expectation. At Pearl Harbor itself, commanders faced conflicting priorities. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short were responsible for defending Hawaii, but they operated under assumptions shaped by Washington. They prepared for sabotage, not surprise attack. Aircraft were clustered for ease of guard. Patrols were limited. Resources were finite, and vigilance was selective. Even when intelligence reached Hawaii, it arrived stripped of context. Magic was so secret that its contents were tightly controlled. Field commanders were not fully informed of what Washington knew. Information meant to protect sources instead isolated those who needed it most. Secrecy became a barrier to readiness. In hindsight, the pieces appear obvious, but at the time they were scattered, ambiguous, and burdened by precedent. Intelligence did not shout. It whispered, and those whispers were drowned out by routine, confidence, and the belief that war, if it came, would announce itself more clearly. Pearl Harbor was not a failure of listening, but believing. The signals were there. The danger was sensed. But the leap from possibility to probability was never made. In that gap between knowledge and conviction, the Japanese fleet sailed unseen, and history edged closer to disaster. When the attack came, it did not expose ignorance. It exposed hesitation. The intelligence community had seen the storm forming, but it never imagined lightning would strike so far from the expected horizon. That misjudgment would haunt every assessment that followed, reshaping how America thought about warning, surprise, and the cost of assuming the enemy would think the same way. The morning of December 7th, 1941, began like countless others at Pearl Harbor. Sunday routines were relaxed. Crews slept late. Mess halls prepared breakfast. The harbor lay calm under clear skies. Battleships lined neatly along Battleship Row. their silhouettes familiar and reassuring. No one expected history to arrive before breakfast. At 6 a.m., far north of Oahu, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind. Their decks came alive with motion. Mechanics pulled away chocks. Engines roared. One by one, aircraft lifted into the sky. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, heading south toward an unsuspecting target. Radio silence held. Surprise was intact. At 7:02 a.m., 2 young radar operators at Opana Point detected a massive blip approaching from the north. It was the largest radar contact they had ever seen. Unsure what to make of it, they reported the sighting to the information center. The officer on duty, inexperienced and expecting a flight of American B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive that morning, dismissed the contact as friendly. The radar station was shut down shortly afterward. Minutes later, the first Japanese planes descended out of the clouds. At 7:48 a.m., explosions ripped through the harbor. Torpedoes slammed into battleships. Bombs punched through decks and detonated deep inside hulls. The USS Arizona erupted in a fireball that consumed over 1,000 men in seconds. The blast shattered windows miles away. Black smoke climbed into the sky, visible across Oahu. Confusion reigned. Many sailors thought it was a drill. Others believed ammunition explosions were accidental. Then the rising sun painted on Japanese wings became unmistakable. This was no exercise. This was war. Anti-aircraft guns stood silent at first, locked and unmanned. Ammunition was stored away, secured against sabotage, not attack. Crews scrambled to reach their stations under strafing fire. Some fired rifles at aircraft. Others dove into oily water to escape flames. Heroism emerged instantly, but readiness lagged behind necessity. On Ford Island and nearby airfields, American aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip. Japanese fighters swept in low, methodically destroying them on the ground. Planes meant to defend Hawaii burned without ever leaving the runway. Within minutes, American air power in the Pacific was crippled. Commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Communication lines were jammed or destroyed. Reports were fragmented, often contradictory. Some believed the attack was limited. Others feared invasion. No one knew how many enemy aircraft were involved or whether more waves were coming. They were. The second wave struck shortly after 8:30 a.m., targeting airfields, repair facilities, and ships already burning. It was smaller, but just as deadly. By the time the final Japanese planes turned north and disappeared, Pearl Harbor was unrecognizable. Battleships lay sunk or capsized. Oil burned on the water. The dead and wounded filled makeshift aid stations. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. Its impact would last generations. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Over 1,100 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated in a single morning. And yet, amid the destruction, something crucial had survived. America's aircraft carriers were not in port. Submarine facilities remained largely intact. Fuel storage tanks were untouched. Japan had struck a powerful blow, but not a fatal one. Still, the shock was absolute. The belief that distance protected the United States was obliterated along with the ships. Pearl Harbor exposed not just a military vulnerability, but a psychological one. America had been caught unprepared, not because it lacked warning, but because it could not imagine being attacked so directly. As smoke drifted over the harbor and fires smoldered into the afternoon, one truth became undeniable. Intelligence failures had not ended the war before it began. They had delivered it, unannounced, to America's doorstep, and from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor would emerge a nation determined never to be surprised in the same way again. As the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, the United States faced not only devastation, but an uncomfortable question. How could this have happened? The attack was over, but the reckoning had only begun. Wreckage smoldered in the water, bodies were still being recovered, and yet Washington demanded answers almost immediately. Within hours, suspicion turned inward. Commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, were stunned. They had survived the attack, but their careers would not. Almost at once, Blame began to crystallize around them. They were accused of failing to prepare the base, of ignoring warnings, of negligence. In December 1941, the nation needed accountability, and the men on the ground were the most visible targets. Investigations followed rapidly. The Robbers Commission, convened just days after the attack, concluded that Kimmel and Short had committed derelictions of duty. They were relieved of command, reduced in rank, and effectively exiled from public service. To many Americans, the verdict was satisfying. Justice appeared swift. Responsibility seemed assigned. But the truth was far more complicated. Behind closed doors, intelligence officials understood that the failures extended far beyond Hawaii. Warnings had been fragmented across agencies. Intercepts had gone untranslated. Critical information had stalled in bureaucratic bottlenecks. No single commander possessed the full picture. Not Kimmel, not Short, not even senior leaders in Washington. Yet admitting that truth carried dangerous implications. It would mean acknowledging systemic failure at the highest levels of government. It would reveal that the United States had known Japan was preparing for war, but could not determine where or when the blow would fall. In the aftermath of disaster, such admissions were politically intolerable, so the narrative narrowed. Pearl Harbor was framed as a local failure rather than a national one. Responsibility was pushed downward. The broader intelligence breakdown, diffuse, institutional, and deeply structural, was largely obscured from the public. For years, this version of events dominated American memory. Textbooks described surprise and unpreparedness. Films depicted sleepy sailors and inattentive commanders. The idea that warning signs existed but were misunderstood faded into the background. Meanwhile, classified files told a different story. As wartime secrecy relaxed, documents began to surface. Congressional investigations reopened the case. Testimony revealed missed cables, delayed translations, and unclear directives. Analysts had been overwhelmed. Decision-makers had been cautious, unsure how to act on incomplete information. The system had been designed to prevent sabotage, not to anticipate a strategic ambush across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was not the result of ignorance. It was a result of fragmentation. Each agency held a piece of the puzzle, but no one assembled the whole picture. Intelligence, by nature uncertain, became paralyzed by its own complexity. Signals contradicted one another. Human reports conflicted with assumptions. And in the absence of certainty, leaders defaulted to normalcy. The price of that normalcy was paid in blood. For Admiral Kimmel and General Short, vindication came slowly, if at all. Both maintained their innocence until death. Decades later, historians would argue that they were scapegoats for failures far beyond their control. Official exoneration efforts continued into the 21st century, reflecting how deeply unresolved the issue remained. Pearl Harbor forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable reality. Intelligence does not fail loudly. It fails quietly through delay, doubt, and disbelief. The warning signs are often visible only in hindsight. By the time clarity arrives, it is too late. From this realization emerged sweeping change. Intelligence coordination became a national priority. Structures were reorganized. Information sharing protocols were formalized. The lessons of Pearl Harbor would echo through future generations of analysts, shaping how threats were evaluated and how warnings were framed. But no reform could undo December 7th. The attack had shattered illusions of invulnerability. It had exposed the cost of assuming tomorrow would look like yesterday. And it had revealed that the most dangerous failures are not those of courage or capability, but of imagination. Pearl Harbor was not just a military defeat. It was a failure to believe that the unthinkable could happen. And that lesson would haunt American intelligence for the rest of the century. In the months and years following Pearl Harbor, the United States did not simply rebuild ships and aircraft. It rebuilt how it understood danger. The attack became more than a tragedy. It became a permanent reference point, a warning embedded deep within American strategic thinking. Every future threat will be measured against December 7th, 1941. The most immediate change came in intelligence coordination. Before Pearl Harbor, American intelligence existed as a loose constellation of competing agencies. The Army and Navy guarded information jealously. Analysts worked in isolation. There was no single authority responsible for synthesizing intelligence into a coherent national assessment. Pearl Harbor exposed the fatal weakness of that model. Gradually, reform followed. Information sharing improved. Warning systems were standardized. Analysts were encouraged, sometimes ordered, to consider worst-case scenarios, not just probable ones. The idea that a surprise attack was unlikely, once a comfortable assumption, was replaced by institutional paranoia. Vigilance became doctrine. This shift shaped every major conflict that followed. During the Cold War, Pearl Harbor loomed over nuclear strategy. American leaders feared a bolt from the blue, a sudden Soviet nuclear strike that could decapitate command structures before retaliation was possible. Early warning radar systems, airborne alert patrols, and missile detection networks were all designed with Pearl Harbor in mind. Never again would the nation be caught unaware. Yet the lesson cut both ways. Fear of surprise also produced overreaction. Intelligence assessments increasingly leaned toward caution, sometimes exaggerating threats rather than underestimating them. False alarms occurred. Near misses accumulated. On several occasions during the Cold War, technical glitches suggested incoming nuclear attacks that did not exist. The memory of Pearl Harbor pushed leaders toward rapid decision-making under extreme uncertainty. The shadow of 1941 remained long. In Vietnam, intelligence failures took a different form. Warnings were not ignored, but misinterpreted. Analysts struggled to understand unconventional warfare. Political assumptions distorted intelligence conclusions. Pearl Harbor had taught America to expect surprise, but not how to understand complexity. Once again, the gap between information and interpretation proved costly. After the Cold War, the lessons seemed to fade. As decades passed without a direct attack on the American homeland, confidence returned. Technology advanced. Satellites watched every corner of the globe. Data flowed faster than ever before. The belief grew that surprise on the scale of Pearl Harbor was no longer possible. The world felt transparent. Then came September 11th, 2001. Almost immediately, comparisons were drawn. Once again, intelligence warnings had existed. Once again, they were scattered across agencies. Once again, the pieces were never fully assembled in time. Congressional hearings echoed familiar language. Missed signals, bureaucratic silos, assumptions that blinded analysts to unconventional threats. Pearl Harbor had happened again, not in form, but in function. This realization cemented the attack's legacy. Pearl Harbor was no longer just history. It was a recurring pattern. Intelligence failures were not anomalies. They were structural risks inherent in complex systems facing adaptive enemies. The deeper lesson was sobering. Information alone does not prevent surprise. Interpretation matters. Imagination matters. The willingness to challenge assumptions matters most of all. Pearl Harbor demonstrated that the greatest danger often comes from what leaders believe cannot happen. Japanese carrier aircraft attacking Hawaii seemed implausible. Terrorists using civilian airliners as weapons seemed unimaginable. In both cases, the problem was not lack of data, but lack of belief. For intelligence professionals, Pearl Harbor became a case study in humility. It warned against certainty. It reminded analysts that adversaries think differently, exploit expectations, and thrive on complacency. Every generation is vulnerable to its own version of surprise. And yet, despite all the lessons learned, the risk remains. No system can eliminate uncertainty. No reform can guarantee foresight. Intelligence will always operate in shades of gray, balancing incomplete information against time pressure and political consequences. Pearl Harbor did not teach how to see the future clearly. It taught how dangerous it is to assume the future will resemble the past. The attack's legacy is not just reform. It is caution, a permanent reminder etched into American strategic culture that the most catastrophic failures are rarely sudden. They are built slowly, through ignored warnings, competing priorities, and the quiet comfort of disbelief. When the next surprise comes, leaders will once again ask the same question asked in December 1941. How do we not see this coming? And the answer may sound hauntingly familiar. Pearl Harbor endures not because of the explosions, but because of the silence that came before them. The quiet hours when warnings sat unread, assumptions went unchallenged, and certainty replaced caution. That silence is what history remembers most clearly, because it is the part that repeats. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States was not blind. It was distracted. Information existed. Signals were detected. Reports were filed. But meaning never fully crystallized into action. The machinery of intelligence worked, but not together, not fast enough, and not with the imagination required to grasp the unimaginable. That is the most unsettling legacy of Pearl Harbor. The failure was not one of cowardice or incompetence. It was human. Analysts trusted patterns. Commanders trusted precedent. Leaders trusted that rational actors would behave as expected. Japan did not, and that divergence proved catastrophic. In the decades since, Pearl Harbor has been invoked whenever disaster follows warning. It has become shorthand for systemic failure, a cautionary tale told to every intelligence officer, every military planner, every policymaker tasked with anticipating danger. Yet the story remains unresolved because its core problem has no permanent solution. Surprise is not an accident. It is a strategy. Adversaries succeed not by hiding everything, but by exploiting belief, by acting in ways defenders dismiss as irrational, impractical, or impossible. Pearl Harbor worked because American leaders believed Japan would never gamble its carrier fleet so far from home. That belief shaped decisions more powerfully than any intercepted message. This is a paradox intelligence cannot escape. To predict the future, it must rely on patterns. To avoid surprise, it must also imagine breaks from those patterns. The tension between probability and possibility defines every warning system ever built. Pearl Harbor revealed what happens when probability dominates. Its lessons reshaped institutions, doctrines, and budgets. Yet no amount of reform could eliminate the human tendency to normalize risk. Over time, vigilance fades. Familiarity breeds comfort. The extraordinary becomes routine. Warnings become background noise. The cycle begins again. That is why Pearl Harbor still matters. It is not simply a story about 1941. It is a warning about today and tomorrow, about how modern societies process overwhelming amount of information, about how leaders decide what deserves attention and what can wait, about how confidence, once earned, can quietly become vulnerability. Technology has changed. The dilemma has not. Satellites now watch oceans once scanned by binoculars. Algorithms replace code breakers. Data moves at the speed of light. And yet, the fundamental challenge remains the same, turning fragments into foresight before it is too late. Pearl Harbor reminds us that intelligence failure is rarely dramatic in advance. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly through misconnections and deferred decisions. By the time clarity arrives, it is usually accompanied by smoke. For the families who lost loved ones, for the sailors trapped below decks, for the pilots caught on the ground, these lessons came at an unbearable cost. Their loss transformed American history. It ended isolation. It propelled the United States into global war. And it reshaped how a nation understood its own vulnerability. The attack forced America to accept a painful truth. Oceans are not walls. Power is not protection. And certainty is not security. That truth remains relevant. Every generation believes it will recognize the next Pearl Harbor in time. Every generation is wrong at least once. The form changes. The warning signs differ. But the core failure, the gap between knowing and acting, endures. Pearl Harbor does not accuse. It cautions. It asks leaders to doubt their assumptions. It asks analysts to challenge consensus. It asks societies to remain alert even when peace feels permanent. And it reminds us that the most dangerous moment often comes not when threats are hidden, but when they are visible, familiar, and underestimated. The bombs fell only after years of ignored possibility. That is the real intelligence failure, and it is never entirely in the past.